What if the tears you've been ashamed of are actually proof of your strength? When someone cries easily, we are quick to assume fragility. Yet psychology suggests something far more nuanced. Some individuals possess a heightened emotional sensitivity, a nervous system that registers experience with greater depth and subtlety. They do not merely observe life, they absorb it. A passing comment, a shift in tone, an image of injustice, a moment of beauty, all of it penetrates more deeply into their inner world. This responsiveness is not a defect of character. It reflects a finely tuned awareness. In analytical psychology, we might say such individuals have a thinner boundary between conscious awareness and the emotional currents moving beneath it. They are less defended, more permeable to experience. And while this permeability can make them more vulnerable to pain, it also grants them access to richer meaning, empathy, and insight. Tears, in this sense, are not evidence of weakness, but of contact with one's own psyche and with the emotional reality of others. The person who cries easily is often the person who feels fully, and to feel fully is to live consciously. Perhaps the question is not why you cry, but how deeply you are willing to experience your own humanity. There is also a biological dimension to this discussion that we cannot ignore. Research on sensory processing, sensitivity, suggests that some individuals are neurologically wired to process stimuli more deeply. Their brains show increased activation in areas associated with empathy, awareness, and emotional meaning making. In simple terms, they do not skim the surface of experience, they enter it. Such people notice subtleties others overlook. A slight hesitation in someone's voice, the unspoken tension in a room, the emotional undertone beneath ordinary conversation. This depth of processing does not switch off when things become intense. It continues working, integrating, reflecting, interpreting. Tears often emerge, not because the person is overwhelmed in a childish sense, but because their system is metabolizing a greater volume of emotional information from a psychological perspective. This trait can be understood as a form of heightened consciousness. It is the psyche responding honestly to reality without excessive numbing or denial. Of course, without boundaries, this sensitivity can become exhausting. But when understood and integrated, it becomes discernment, creativity, and profound relational intelligence. The task, then, is not to harden yourself against feeling. It is to learn how to carry your depth without apologizing for it. We must also consider that crying is not merely an emotional display. It is a regulatory function of the psyche and the body. When emotion builds without expression, it does not disappear. It accumulates. The organism seeks equilibrium. Tears are one of the mechanisms through which that equilibrium is restored. Biologically, emotional crying activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for calming and recovery. What appears outwardly as losing control is often the body's precise attempt to regain it. Psychologically, tears signal acknowledgement. They mark the moment when an experience is allowed into consciousness rather than forced into repression. And repression, as depth psychology reminds us, is costly. What we refuse to feel does not vanish. It descends into the unconscious, where it influences us indirectly through tension, irritability, numbness, or even illness. To cry is to participate consciously in one's own emotional process. It is the psyche completing a cycle instead of interrupting it. When we deny ourselves that release in the name of strength, we confuse suppression with mastery. Real strength lies not in resisting emotion, but in allowing it to move through us without fear. The question is not whether you feel, it is whether you permit yourself to heal. There is another dimension to consider: the relationship between tears and empathy. Those who cry easily are often those who feel with others, not merely for them. When they witness suffering, injustice, or even profound beauty, something within them resonates. This resonance is not sentimental weakness, it is psychological attunement. Their inner world mirrors the emotional states of those around them. From a depth psychological perspective, this suggests a thinner barrier between self and other, a capacity to recognize shared humanity. Empathy requires imagination, and imagination requires openness. When we allow ourselves to be moved, we momentarily dissolve the illusion of separateness. Tears, in this sense, are evidence of connection. They show that the suffering or joy of another has been acknowledged within one's own psyche. Of course, such openness demands boundaries and maturity. Without reflection, empathy can become emotional exhaustion. But when integrated, it becomes compassion. The ability not only to feel, but to respond consciously and constructively. In a world that often rewards detachment, the person who can still be moved is not behind. They are awake. And perhaps the deeper question is this: will you choose indifference, or will you allow yourself to remain human? Yet, despite the biological and psychological validity of tears, many of us were taught early that crying is unacceptable. A child falls and is told, "Stop crying." A boy shows emotion and is reminded to be strong. Over time, these messages crystallize into an internal command: do not reveal vulnerability. And so we begin to equate composure with worth, restraint with maturity. But social conditioning is not the same as psychological truth. When a culture prizes emotional suppression, individuals learn to split themselves. The outer persona appears controlled, while the inner emotional life is pushed into shadow. Depth psychology warns us about this division. What is denied does not disappear. It gathers energy in the unconscious. The cost of maintaining the mask is often anxiety, disconnection, or a vague sense of emptiness. To cry then can feel like a violation of the persona we have constructed. It threatens the image of competence we work so hard to maintain. Yet authenticity begins precisely where the mask loosens. When we question the inherited belief that tears signify weakness, we reclaim parts of ourselves that were exiled for the sake of approval. The courage to feel openly may be the first step toward becoming whole. When we gather all of this together, sensitivity, depth of processing, emotional regulation, empathy, and the weight of social conditioning, a different picture begins to emerge. The person who cries easily is not deficient in strength. They are often closer to their inner life, and closeness to one's inner life requires courage. It demands that we face what we feel without anesthetizing ourselves or hiding behind performance. Vulnerability, in this sense, is not exposure for its own sake. It is alignment. It is the refusal to live divided. Depth psychology teaches that wholeness comes from integration, from allowing the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self to meet. Tears can be part of that meeting. They signal that something meaningful has been touched, that the psyche is alive and responsive. Of course, maturity involves learning when and how to express emotion wisely. Strength is not uncontrolled display, but neither is it emotional paralysis. True resilience is the capacity to feel deeply and still remain grounded, to be moved and yet remain centered. So perhaps crying often is not a sign that you are falling apart. Perhaps it is evidence that you are awake. The question is not whether you feel too much. It is whether you will honor what you feel and grow from it.